Isabella's hands trembled as she sat alone at the corner table of Bella Notte, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant. The diamond wedding ring on her finger felt heavier than ever as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. She pressed her other hand protectively against her still flat stomach, where a secret grew, a secret she'd been trying to tell her husband for 3 days. But Dante Moretti, the most feared mafia boss in New York, had left her here as punishment. "Maybe sitting alone will teach you not to disappear without my permission," his cold voice echoed in her mind. He had no idea she'd been at the doctor's office, confirming what she'd suspected for weeks. Now, as shadows moved outside the restaurant windows and unfamiliar faces lingered too long on the street, Isabella realized this punishment might cost more than her pride. It might cost everything. If you want to discover how this dangerous love story began and what happens when Isabella's secret is finally revealed, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more emotional stories like this one. 6 months earlier, Isabella Romano had been serving tables at a small Brooklyn diner, counting every tip to help pay her father's mounting debts. She never imagined that one rainy Tuesday evening would change her life forever. The bell above the diner door chimed, and she looked up to see 3 men in expensive suits enter. The entire restaurant fell silent. Even Mrs. Chen, the tough-as-nails owner, seemed to shrink behind the counter. The man in the center commanded attention without saying a word. Tall, devastatingly handsome, with dark hair and eyes like storm clouds. His presence filled the room with an energy that made Isabella's skin prickle. "We're looking for Tony Romano," the man said, his voice smooth as silk but sharp as a blade. Isabella's blood turned to ice. Her father. He's not here," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Those gray eyes found hers across the room and she felt like he could see straight through to her soul. "And you are?" "Isabella, his daughter." The man studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn uniform, her tired eyes, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. "Dante Moretti," he said simply, as if the name should mean something to her. It did. Everyone in Brooklyn knew that name. "Your father owes my family a considerable amount of money, Isabella Romano. Money he doesn't have." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "How much?" $200,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. Her father's gambling addiction had spiraled completely out of control. We don't have that kind of money. But I can work, I can pay you back, I just need time." "Time," Dante repeated, stepping closer. She caught a hint of expensive cologne, saw the way his suit was perfectly tailored to his powerful frame. "Time is a luxury your father exhausted months ago." Isabella's mind raced. She thought of her father, probably passed out drunk in their tiny apartment, completely unaware that his daughter was facing down the most dangerous man in New York. "What do you want from us?" Dante's eyes never left her face. "There is an alternative arrangement we could discuss." Something in his tone made her stomach flip. "What kind of arrangement?" "Marriage." The word hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Isabella's legs nearly gave out. "I'm sorry, what?" "You marry me, your father's debt disappears. You refuse." He shrugged elegantly. "Well, let's just say your father won't be gambling anymore." Isabella's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. "Why would you want to marry me? You don't even know me." For the first time, something almost like vulnerability flickered in his eyes. "I need a wife. Someone uncomplicated. Someone who understands that this would be a business arrangement, nothing more. And if I say no, then we collect the debt another way." The threat was clear. Isabella thought of her father, of the life she'd built, serving coffee and saving every penny. Then she looked at Dante Moretti, this beautiful, terrifying man who held her family's fate in his hands. "I need time to think. You have until tomorrow night." The next evening, Isabella stood in the same spot, wearing her best dress, a simple black number she'd bought for her high school graduation. Dante arrived alone this time, looking impossibly elegant in a charcoal suit. "Have you decided?" Isabella lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed. "Yes, I'll marry you." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps even respect. "You understand what this means? You'll live in my world now. There are rules, expectations. I understand. And you understand that this is purely business. I won't pretend to love you, and I don't expect you to love me." The words stung more than they should have. I understand. Dante stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. Then we have a deal, Mrs. Moretti. The wedding happened a week later in a small ceremony at City Hall. Isabella wore a simple white dress Dante had bought for her, the first of many expensive gifts that would follow. As they exchanged vows, she caught glimpses of the man beneath the cold exterior, the way his hand was gentle when he slipped the ring onto her finger, the way he whispered, "You're safe now," so quietly only she could hear. But safety, Isabella would learn, was relative in Dante Moretti's world. Their first months of marriage were a careful dance around each other. Dante was unfailingly polite but distant, treating her more like a house guest than a wife. He gave her everything money could buy: designer clothes, jewelry, a black card with no limit, but never himself. Isabella tried to find her place in his world. She learned the names of his men, the unspoken rules of mafia wives, the way to move through his mansion without disturbing the dangerous business conducted behind closed doors. She discovered that Dante spoke fluent Italian when he was angry, that he worked until 3 a.m. most nights, and that sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What she didn't know was that Dante was fighting his own battle. He'd expected his contract bride to be meek, forgettable. Instead, Isabella Romano had walked into his life with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine, and every day it became harder to remember why he'd sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him. The morning Isabella discovered she was pregnant, she'd been married to Dante for exactly 5 months and 3 days. She stared at the positive test in the marble bathroom of their penthouse, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and unexpected joy. She had to tell him, but first, she needed to see the doctor, to be absolutely certain. That decision would change everything. Isabella slipped out of the penthouse at 10 a.m., her heart hammering as she made her way to the parking garage. For the first time in months, she'd managed to leave without her assigned bodyguard, Marco, who was dealing with a situation for Dante downtown. She'd told herself this was necessary. The pregnancy test could be wrong. She needed confirmation before she turned Dante's carefully controlled world upside down. But as she sat in Dr. Sarah Chen's office an hour later, staring at the ultrasound screen, reality crashed over her in waves. "Congratulations, Mrs. Moretti. You're about 6 weeks along. Everything looks perfectly healthy." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. A baby. Dante's baby. The child of a man who'd married her for convenience, who'd never even kissed her properly, who treated their marriage like a business contract. I need to think about this," she whispered. Dr. Chen's expression softened. "This is overwhelming. I understand. But you have time. Would you like me to print some pictures for you?" Isabella nodded numbly, clutching the ultrasound photos as she made her way back to the penthouse. She needed to tell Dante immediately. This changed everything between them. But when she walked through the front door, she found Dante standing in the foyer like a storm about to break. "Where were you?" His voice was deadly quiet, which Isabella had learned was far more dangerous than when he shouted. I had an appointment." "What kind of appointment?" His gray eyes were ice cold, scanning her face for lies. Isabella's hand moved protectively to her purse, where the ultrasound photos were hidden. "A doctor's appointment." "You're sick?" The question came out sharp, almost concerned. "No, I'm not sick. Dante, I need to tell you something. You left without Marco." He cut her off, stepping closer. "You disappeared for 3 hours without telling anyone where you were going. Do you have any idea how that looked?" Isabella's heart sank. She could see the suspicion in his eyes, the way his jaw was clenched. "I can explain. Can you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife tried to run away." "I wasn't running away." The words came out louder than she intended. "I would never." "Wouldn't you?" Dante's voice turned cruel. "You think I don't see how you look at this life? How you flinch every time one of my men walks into a room? How you've never once acted like you actually want to be here?" Each word hit like a physical blow. Isabella felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Dante laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nothing about this is fair, Isabella, but we made a deal, and you don't get to break it just because you're having second thoughts." "I'm not having second thoughts. If you would just listen to me, I've heard enough." Dante turned away from her, straightening his cufflinks with sharp, angry movements. "I have a dinner meeting tonight at Bella Notte. You're coming with me." Isabella's stomach dropped. Bellanotte was where Dante conducted his most important business. Wives were rarely invited unless it was a special occasion. Why? Because apparently you need a reminder of what your life looks like now, what you chose. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. She had chosen this life, had walked into it willingly to save her father. But what Dante didn't understand was that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being just about the debt. Somewhere along the way, she'd started to care about him. That evening, Isabella dressed carefully in a midnight blue dress Dante had bought her, her hands shaking as she applied lipstick. The ultrasound photos were tucked safely in her jewelry box. She'd tell him after dinner when he'd calmed down. The ride to the restaurant was silent, tension crackling between them in the back of the black SUV. Dante stared out the window, his profile sharp and unforgiving in the city lights. At Bellanotte, Isabella recognized several of Dante's associates already seated at the large corner table. She'd met most of them before, dangerous men with cold eyes and expensive suits. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a test. Dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and meaningful looks between the men. Isabella picked at her food, her stomach churning with morning sickness and anxiety. Every time she tried to catch Dante's eye, he looked away. Finally, as dessert was being served, Dante's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression darkening. "I have to take this," he said, standing abruptly. "It's urgent." Isabella watched him walk toward the restaurant's back exit, phone already pressed to his ear. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand clenched into a fist. Whatever the call was about, it wasn't good news. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Isabella checked her watch. Dante had been gone for 20 minutes. The other men at the table were growing restless, exchanging glances she didn't like. "Where did he go?" she asked Marco, Dante's second in command. Marco's expression was carefully neutral. "Business call, he'll be back." But another 10 minutes passed and Dante didn't return. Isabella's anxiety spiked when she saw Marco receive a text message, his face going pale as he read it. "Mrs. Moretti," Marco said quietly, leaning toward her. "The boss had to leave, emergency situation." "What kind of emergency?" Isabella's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Family business," he said. Marco hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He said you should stay here and think about the choices you've made today." The words hit Isabella like a slap. Around the table, the other men were avoiding her eyes, clearly aware of what was happening. Dante had left her here, alone, in front of his entire crew, as punishment. Isabella felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her chin up. "I see. He'll send a car for you later," Marco added, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure when that would be. As the men began to leave one by one, offering awkward goodbyes, Isabella found herself alone at the corner table of Bellanotte, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach where Dante's child was growing. He'd left her here to teach her a lesson about obedience, about knowing her place. He had no idea he'd just abandoned his pregnant wife in the most dangerous part of the city. Isabella sat alone at the corner table, the restaurant's warm lighting suddenly feeling harsh and exposing. The last of Dante's men had left 15 minutes ago, and now she was truly alone. The waiters moved around her with careful politeness, but she could see the pity in their eyes. She checked her phone for the third time. No messages from Dante, no word about when someone would come for her. Her hand moved to her stomach again, a gesture that was becoming instinctive. "It's okay, little one," she whispered. "Daddy doesn't know about you yet, but when he does..." The thought trailed off. Would Dante even want this baby? Their marriage was supposed to be business only. A child would complicate everything. "Excuse me, Mrs. Moretti." Isabella looked up to see their waiter, a young man with kind eyes who'd been serving their table all evening. "Yes? I'm sorry to bother you, but we're closing soon. Would you like me to call you a taxi?" Isabella's cheeks burned with fresh humiliation. "No, thank you. Someone's coming for me." But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. What if Dante was so angry he'd decided to leave her here all night? What if this was more than just a lesson? What if this was his way of telling her their arrangement was over? The waiter nodded and moved away, but Isabella caught him glancing at her with concern. She was the wife of the most powerful man in the city, and she was stranded like a teenager whose parents forgot to pick her up. 20 minutes later, the restaurant was nearly empty. Isabella was about to swallow her pride and call for a taxi when she noticed two men at the bar who hadn't been there before. They were trying to look casual, but something about them set off alarm bells in her mind. One of them was watching her in the mirror behind the bar. When their eyes met in the reflection, he quickly looked away, but not before she caught something cold and calculating in his expression. Isabella's blood chilled. In the months since marrying Dante, she'd learned to recognize danger. These men didn't belong here. They were too alert, too focused on her, and they definitely weren't Dante's people. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling to Marco's number. But before she could call, one of the men stood up and started walking toward her table. "Mrs. Moretti?" His voice was smooth, polite, but Isabella could hear the threat underneath. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my boss would like to have a word with you." "I don't know who your boss is," Isabella said, proud that her voice came out steady. "But I'm waiting for my husband." The man smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Your husband seems to have forgotten about you. Lucky for you, my boss is more attentive to beautiful women." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced around the restaurant, but the few remaining customers were absorbed in their own conversations. The waiters were busy cleaning up. No one was paying attention to the polite conversation happening at the corner table. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Isabella said, starting to stand. "I should go. Sit down." The command was quiet, but absolute. Isabella saw the bulge under the man's jacket and slowly sank back into her chair. "That's better. Now, Mrs. Moretti, you're going to come with us quietly. No scenes, no screaming. Just a nice, peaceful walk to the car outside." Isabella's mind raced. She thought of the baby growing inside her, of Dante, who had no idea where she was or what was happening. "What do you want with me?" "Let's just say your husband has something that belongs to my boss. Consider this collateral." The second man had moved closer now, positioning himself to block any escape route. Isabella realized with growing terror that this had been planned. They'd been waiting for her to be alone, vulnerable. "My husband will kill you for this," she whispered. "Your husband," the first man said with amusement, "left his pregnant wife alone in a restaurant. Doesn't seem like he cares that much about your safety." Isabella's blood turned to ice. How did they know she was pregnant? She'd only found out herself that morning. "Oh yes, Mrs. Moretti. We know about the baby." Makes this whole situation more interesting, doesn't it? Isabella's protective instincts flared. Whatever happened to her, she had to protect this child. "Please," she said quietly. "I'll come with you, but please don't hurt my baby." "That depends entirely on how cooperative you are." The man gestured toward the restaurant's side exit, away from the main entrance where people might see them. Isabella stood on shaking legs, her mind desperately searching for options. But with two armed men and a restaurant full of innocent people, she had no choice. As they walked toward the exit, Isabella caught the eye of their waiter. For a split second, she considered screaming, fighting, making a scene. But the man beside her shifted his jacket just enough to remind her of the gun underneath. Instead, she mouthed a single word: "Help." The waiter's eyes widened, and Isabella saw him reach for his phone as the men ushered her through the side door. Outside, a black sedan waited with its engine running. Isabella's last coherent thought before they pushed her into the back seat was that Dante had been wrong about one thing. She wasn't trying to run away from his world. His world was trying to take her away from him. And now, with his child growing inside her, the stakes had never been higher. As the car pulled away from Bella Notte, Isabella pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered a prayer that somehow, some way, Dante would realize she was gone before it was too late. But Dante was across town, dealing with what he thought was a crisis, completely unaware that the real emergency was happening to the wife he'd left behind as punishment, the wife who was carrying his child, the wife who might not survive the night. Dante's phone rang just as he finished dealing with the warehouse situation, a false alarm that had cost him 3 hours and nearly gotten 2 of his men killed. He was already in a foul mood when he saw Marco's name on the screen. "What is it?" he answered curtly. "Boss, we have a problem." Marco's voice was tight with panic. "It's about Mrs. Moretti." Dante's blood chilled. "What about Isabella?" "She's gone. Taken from Bella Notte about an hour ago." The waiter saw 2 men force her into a car. The world tilted on its axis. Dante gripped the phone so hard he was surprised it didn't crack. "What do you mean taken?" "Santini's men. They were waiting for her to be alone." Marco Santini, Dante's oldest rival, The one man in New York who'd been trying to destroy the Moretti family for years, and Dante had handed him the perfect weapon by leaving Isabella unprotected. Get every man we have. Dante's voice came out deadly calm. I want the city torn apart until we find her. Boss, there's something else. Marco's hesitation made Dante's stomach drop. The waiter said, he said one of the men mentioned something about her being pregnant. Dante's world stopped. What? He said they knew about the baby. That's why they took her. Pregnant. Isabella was pregnant. With his child. And he'd left her alone, defenseless, because he'd been too proud and too stupid to listen to what she'd been trying to tell him. The doctor's appointment. Her nervousness. The way she'd been trying to talk to him all day. She'd been trying to tell him about the baby. Find them, Dante said, his voice barely human. Find them now, or I'll burn this entire city to the ground. Meanwhile, Isabella sat in the back of the sedan, her wrists zip-tied behind her back, trying to stay calm for the sake of the baby. The two men hadn't spoken since they'd left the restaurant, but she could feel their tension. Where are you taking me? She asked finally. The man in the passenger seat turned around. Somewhere your husband will never find you, unless he's willing to make a trade. What kind of trade? The Moretti shipping contracts, the dock territories, everything your husband has built, in exchange for his pretty little wife and his unborn child. Isabella's heart sank. Dante would never give up everything he'd worked for. Not even for her. Their marriage was business. Nothing more. He'd told her that himself. But then she thought about the way he'd looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. The way he'd whispered, "You're safe now," during their wedding ceremony. The way he'd bought her favorite coffee every morning without her ever asking. Maybe there was more to Dante Moretti than even he wanted to admit. The car pulled into an abandoned warehouse district, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry, and bodies disappeared without a trace. Isabella's fear spiked, but she forced herself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help her baby. Inside the warehouse, she was pushed into a chair while the men made phone calls. She could hear fragments of conversation, something about the package and waiting for confirmation. Mrs. Moretti, a new voice said, and Isabella looked up to see a man in an expensive suit walking toward her. He was older, maybe 50, with cold eyes and a cruel smile. I'm Marco Santini. I believe you've heard of me. Isabella lifted her chin defiantly. I know who you are. Good. Then you know I'm not a patient man. Your husband has something I want, and now I have something he wants. It's a simple transaction. Dante will never give you what you're asking for. Santini's smile widened. Oh, but he will. You see, Mrs. Moretti, I know something about your husband that perhaps you don't. Dante Moretti would burn the world down for the people he loves. And whether he admits it or not, he loves you. Isabella's heart skipped. You're wrong. Our marriage is just business. Is it? Then why did he spend 3 months having you followed and protected before he ever approached your father about the debt? Why did he pay off your father's gambling debts to 3 other families without telling you? Why does he have your favorite flowers delivered to the penthouse every week? Each revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow. That's not... He never said... Dante Moretti doesn't say much about his feelings. But his actions tell a very different story. Before Isabella could process this information fully, Santini's phone rang. He answered it with a sharp, yes? Isabella watched his expression change from confident to concerned to outright alarmed. What do you mean he's not negotiating? Santini snapped into the phone. He has to negotiate, we have his wife. A pause. Then, how many men? Another pause, longer this time. Santini's face went pale. All of them? Every family? Isabella's heart began to race. Whatever was happening, it was big. Santini hung up and turned to his men. Moretti's not playing by the rules. He's called in every favor, every alliance. Half the families in New York are mobilizing to find her. What does that mean? One of his men asked. It means, Santini said grimly, that Dante Moretti is willing to start a war for his wife. Outside, the sound of engines filled the night air. Lots of engines. Isabella's heart soared with hope even as fear gripped her. Dante was coming. But would he be in time? And more importantly, would either of them survive what was about to happen? As the warehouse doors exploded inward and gunfire erupted, Isabella closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her unborn child. The war for Isabella Moretti had begun. 6 months later, Isabella stood on the balcony of their penthouse watching the sunset paint Manhattan in shades of gold and crimson. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, where their daughter kicked restlessly. "She's going to be a fighter," Dante said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind, just like her mother. Isabella leaned back against his chest, still marveling at how much had changed since that terrifying night at the warehouse. Dante had arrived with what seemed like half of New York's underworld behind him, and the resulting firefight had ended Santini's threat permanently. But more than that, it had ended the walls between them. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered, as he'd untied her hands in the aftermath. "I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I almost lost you both." "Both?" she'd asked, confused. "Our baby," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I know about the baby. And Isabella, I love you. I've loved you since the day you agreed to marry me to save your father. I was just too scared to admit it." Now, as their daughter moved beneath her heart and Dante's arms held them both safe, Isabella knew that some contracts were worth more than business. Some contracts were written in love. This story has reached its end. If it touched your heart in any way, leave your like and share it with someone who also enjoys emotional stories. New stories are coming soon. Until next time.